Thomas here again, and today I am building the Tycho II BT50 fiberglass model rocket by Mach1 rocketry. Now, Mach1 has kind of a strange business model. You don't get the entire kit. You can buy a basic kit that has all the parts but not the decals, and then the decals and even the instruction sheet you have to buy separately. So when I bought this kit, I did spend the extra money to get the decals here, but not the instructions. And unfortunately, they won't even just let you download instructions from the website. So usually I make the disclaimer that you should follow the instructions, and the video should just be a counterpart or a supplement to that. In this case, the video is the instructions. I recommend that you use rubber gloves or nitrile gloves when you're handling the fiberglass. Handling the smooth areas is fine, but anywhere that the fiberglass has been cut, you have the potential of getting little fiberglass slivers and such in your hands. So I do recommend that you wear gloves when you're actually doing the handling of this. Now, what I will say in favor of these kits go together very much like a standard cardboard and balsa wood kit. The main difference is that you're going to be using epoxy and gel superglue for most of the assembly rather than wood glue or white glue. So inside here we've got a pre-slotted body tube, an 18mm motor mount, okay, 2 centering rings, a forward and an aft. This is a retainer sleeve for the engine clip, 3 fins with through-the-wall tabs on them. You have an option here of either using a 3/16 inch launch lug or micro rail buttons. I'm going to be building this with the launch lug because I don't personally own a micro rail. The nose cone is plastic and it has a little base to it that has to be assembled separately. Okay, we've got a small nylon parachute. They give us 2 parachute protectors, and I think that may have been an extra there. You only really need 1. And as I said, I bought the decals separately. And then finally we have a Kevlar shock cord. After washing all the fiberglass, it's a good idea to use some sandpaper and roughen slightly any of the areas that will be epoxied later on. And for this you can use just about anything between 60 grit and 150 grit. And you don't need to do a lot. So I'm right along each of the fin slots here. I'm just going to drag that paper right along just to make a little bit of roughening there to help bind the epoxy. Okay, that's really all it takes. And then do the same thing on the area right along the edge, right along the root edge here of each of the fins. You can get the fin tabs as well. So I'm actually sanding the area to which the fillets will attach. Okay, and then you can go ahead and do the root edge itself, just like that. Now you can also do the same thing for the motor mount tube, but I would wait until after we position the rings to find out where they need to go. Our first task is to assemble the motor mount, and in some of their kits they have a pre-slotted motor mount for the engine clip. This one does not. So here what we'll need to do is first just check and make sure this is a standard sized one, which I expect it is. Yep, so it's for a 70 millimeter long motor, and I prefer to have about a half centimeter overhang. So I'm going to make this the aft end. I'm just going to write on there so I don't get it confused later. Okay, and then I'm going to make a mark here at 6.5 centimeters. Okay, now to make that go through, you won't be able to just punch it through with a hobby knife. You're going to want to use a small file. Now, filing the fiberglass is going to kick up some dust, and so here I've put on some protective equipment. Rubber gloves here. I'm also wearing a mask. You may notice my voice is a little muffled, and I'm wearing safety glasses because little bits of fiberglass that you might inhale or get in your eyes or in your skin are not a lot of fun. Alright, so I'm just taking the corner edge of my file here, there we go. Alright, now I'm going to wipe that off with a tissue with either a little water on it, or I like to use alcohol simply because it evaporates faster. Alright, now I tend to be one of those people that just blows dust out of the way. Don't do that with fiberglass. Okay, so now our engine clip should fit right in there. Now when we put this in, we need to be aware of a few things here. So we're going to have our engine block is going to go in here like that, and we'll put that in with epoxy. All right, but then also we need to make sure that we leave room for the fin tabs here. Okay, so if I grab the centering rings here, all right, one of those is going to go down all the way. There's a notch in there for the engine clip. All right, now my notch is just a little bit narrow there. It's actually got two notches in it. I'll try both of them. Yeah, that's not going to do it either. Okay, so I'm going to come back to my file. I'm just going to extend one of those notches a little bit. It's just a little bit too narrow, so I'll just widen that gap a little. There we go. Okay, so in the end, I want that to be flush with the aft end of the tube, and my centering ring there should be right at the base of that slot. Okay, so that I'm going to go ahead and dry fit one of these fins in here. Okay, it looks like my slots are going to require a little filing, at least that one will. Okay, but if we look down inside there, our centering ring should go right against the edge of the fin tab. Okay, so we can go ahead and take this off again. All right, and now I'm just going to compare it directly to the body tube there. Alright, so I'm going to need a line about right there. Okay, and that is where my lower centering ring should go. Right about there. Okay, now, if I do it that way, I don't have a lot of spring action here. Okay, so that's going to be really hard to load. So instead of making it flush, I'm going to just move this ahead a little bit and allow the engine mount to stick out just a little bit. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and remark that. Okay. Now the forward one, normally I would put that so it's right against the engine clip there. Okay, and what that's going to do is give me enough room in between those two. Okay, and then this will simply go down inside there. Okay, now I'm going to make one more notch in the centering ring for the forward one, so that I've got an anchor point for my shock cord. Okay, so just about like that. All right, I'm going to clean that up again. Okay, now we're going to take the shock cord here, and first I'm just going to see how long this is. So for long skinny rockets, the rule of thumb is 3 times the rocket length. I'm just going to go with the body tube here first of all. I don't have the nose cone applied. All right, this is about 4 times the body tube length, so that should be good. All right, they got a little bit of masking tape on this. And I recommend for this part take a little bit of super glue and put that on the fraying ends there and go down a little bit. Okay, and we just need that to soak in for just a moment. And then just wipe off the excess. All right, and that'll check the fraying there, and also as it hardens, it'll make it easier to thread through things. All right, over here on the other side, we'll do the same thing. Okay, now we still haven't glued anything here. And I'm just going to dry fit this to show you how it's going to work. So on my forward centering ring here, I'm going to pass the Kevlar through that notch, and then we'll attach this. Okay, and then after we put the epoxy down, we'll actually tuck this up underneath the ring and epoxy that into place. Okay. Sometimes we'll actually put a knot in it, but there's not going to be that much room in this rocket. So we'll just wrap it around there and put an epoxy fillet in there, and that will hold it in place there as well as holding the engine mount ring. Okay, so I think now we're ready for some epoxy. Now for this, if you're really familiar with using epoxies, you could probably use a 5-minute epoxy. But I'm going to give myself a little bit more working time here and use a 15-minute epoxy. Okay, and you only need a small amount of this. Alright, these are little weigh boats. You can get them from scientific supply houses. You can also get them online in places like Amazon. But I find they're really handy for small amounts of glues. And personally, I've used lots of different brands. I don't see a whole lot of difference between them. Use whatever you like or what you have available. All right, we'll just mix this up here. Okay, so first I'm going to put on the aft centering ring here. So I'm going to go ahead and slide that back on. Let's get the right slot. There we go. Okay, and find my mark. So what I'm going to do is put some epoxy here and then slide that right up to the mark. Okay, and I'm just going to push that right up into there. Okay, that looks pretty perpendicular as it should be. Alright, and then for my forward mount here, I'm going to pull it up a little bit and do the same thing. The first thing I'm going to do is really fill in the excess notch there that we made with the file. Okay, and bring this around. Don't worry too much about the Kevlar cord quite yet. We'll get the epoxy in place first. Alright, now I'm going to slide that into position, making sure that it is also perpendicular. Oop, that one moved a little bit. Okay, now I'm going to take my Kevlar shock cord and put it right up against there and into the epoxy. Okay, I'm going to apply a little more there. Now it's a little stiff there on the end because of the super glue. That shouldn't really pose too much of a problem. And if you need to, you can put a little bit of masking tape down just to hold things in while the epoxy sets. And if it does happen to stick to the tape, you can just tear it off. Okay, that's trying to move on me again there. Alright, now I'm going to put this down on some plastic so I don't accidentally glue it to my mat here. Okay, and then we have the thrust ring here. I'm just going to apply some epoxy all the way around it. And then that simply goes directly into the forward end of the tube and rest up against the engine clip. Alright. Now if you need to do any cleanup, you can use some rubbing alcohol for that. Alright, but for this one I'm just going to let that set and harden for about 15 minutes. My epoxy has at least partially cured, and I can take off the masking tape there and get rid of the used stuff. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is, first of all, make sure that's not sticky. It's a little bit sticky, but it's not going to do anything. This way. Just take the end of the shock cord here and stuff that back down through so that this is out of the way when we go to put the motor into the body tube. Alright, and right now I'm just going to dry fit this. Okay, and as we planned, okay, we're going to want that centering ring here to be just right at that notch. Now the other thing I'm going to do is go ahead and put the fins in and see if we need to widen any of the notches. So that one was okay, it fell right out. That one's okay. And that one's okay. Alright, I'm going to mix up some more epoxy this time, but I'm going to use 5-minute for this. You can go ahead and use whichever epoxy you already have if you like. Don't go out and buy a whole bunch of different epoxies for this. Unless you're going to start doing a lot of fiberglass rockets, then yeah, go ahead and get a bunch of epoxies. But this one I should be able to do relatively quickly. And again, we don't need a whole lot here. Just make yourself a small amount. And now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a bead of epoxy just beyond the fin slot there, up inside. That's one of the nice things about these fiberglass tubes. You can actually see what you're doing inside of it. And you want to be fairly generous with this because you won't be able to reach in there and put in fillets later on. Okay, so I'm now going to push this in partially, but not all the way up to the point where I get it in the epoxy. And something else I'm going to want to do is, personally, I like to have my engine clip on the same side as my launch lug. So I'm going to center that so that it's between two fins, which is where a launch lug would go. Okay, now this one's going to take a little bit more finesse. I'm going to bend this a little bit so that I can put the epoxy right on the inside of the aft end of the body tube. And this is what will grab onto the aft centering ring. Alright, now since I'm using 5-minute epoxy, I need to be fairly quick with this. If you're not that quick, go ahead and just use a longer setting epoxy. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and push this all the way in. Alright, remember I want to stop just before that centering ring reaches the fin slot there. Rotate that just a little bit, and now I'm going to let that set up according to the epoxy time. So I should be able to start working with this again in just over 5 minutes. The epoxy on the motor mount has hardened, and so our next job is to put in the fins. Okay, so here again I'm going to do a dry fit first. Okay, and that should be going right up against the motor mount there. Now you can either use epoxy for this initial placement, or you can use a gel type super glue. I prefer to use the super glue just because it sets quickly. But what we're going to do is tack the edges here. So I'm going to run super glue along the edges, both the root edges and the tab edge there. And that will do the initial placement. And then the actual strength will come from epoxy fillets that we'll put in later on. Now something else, if you want to round the fin edges, you'll probably want to do that before you mount them on. I'm just going to leave mine straight the way they are, just because the fiberglass would just get really messy if I do that. Okay, so here, just apply a thin bead. It does not need to be really gooey, but you do want a thicker type of super glue here. But we don't want it squishing out all over the place. Okay, then go ahead and place that in. Alright, and I pull mine back as far as it will go. Alright, and then go ahead and sight down the tube. Make sure the fin is perpendicular. It's going to be straight, lengthwise at least. Just the fin slots are going to create that. Alright, and then I'm going to let this dry for a few minutes and then go on to the other fins, and then we'll do all of the fin fillets at once. So I'll do the other two fins off camera. The super glue on my fins has hardened, and now in preparation for the fillets, I've applied masking tape down in between each of the fins, leaving a gap of about 3 to 4 millimeters there on each side. And then I've also wrapped the front and rear here. So on the rear I've wrapped around the motor mount tube so we don't get epoxy down in there. And on the front I've left that same gap in the front of the fins. Now we'll also need to put some masking tape on the fins themselves. And likewise leave a gap of about the same amount there. Now you may notice I've got a little gap right there, and that's probably due to a little blob of epoxy on the motor mount tube that may have gotten in the way. That's okay, a small gap like that will easily be filled in with epoxy. Now for this part you're going to want to have gloves, and I recommend really tight fitting gloves so that you get a good smooth surface with your finger there. You're also going to want to have some rubbing alcohol handy, and then something that you can wipe the excess epoxy off your fingers with. Now for this one I'm going to use 15-minute epoxy, and I'm going to use a bit more than we had last time, so I'm going to use a little bit bigger cup to mix this up in. Okay. I'm going to use a popsicle stick here for an applicator. Now these little cups are actually advertised as epoxy cups from online sources. I think I got these from Amazon. Okay, so here I'm going to apply this to facing fins here. And this really doesn't have to be too thick. These are small fins in a relatively small rocket. If you're doing this with a big high power rocket, you'd want a whole lot more here. But if you're thinking about getting the high power fiberglass rockets, this is a good way to get a feel for it. Alright, so this is the fin that had that gap on there, so I'm going to put a little more down there to make sure it gets down inside. Okay, and now I'm going to take my alcohol here and just put a little bit on a finger or two. And this is going to keep the epoxy from sticking to my glove very much. And I'm just going to smooth that in. Okay, wipe off the excess there on the paper towel. Smooth this one in. Do the same thing. Okay, and now I can simply turn to the next fin and continue doing this. And as long as you keep it horizontal, unless you have really runny epoxy, you should be able to do all of these at once, as long as you do it fairly quickly. Now if you want to build up really thick fillets, I recommend doing it in stages. So do this first, and then after you remove the tape and it's completely hardened, add more to it if you want. Some people like to use epoxy clay or epoxy putty for their fillets to really build them up. I'm usually satisfied just with the way this type turns out. Now that we have all that in place, what we'll do is immediately remove the tape. And what this will do is allow the edges of the epoxy fillets to flow a little bit and make a nice blend into the rocket itself. And this is also why I use 15-minute epoxy instead of 5. Because a lot of times a 5-minute epoxy just sets up so quickly that you can't do this part right, and you get kind of ridgy fillets. Get off there. Okay, and then if you need to clean up any little spots where you might have got some epoxy and you don't want it, use a paper towel or tissue and give that a fairly good amount of alcohol on there. Okay, so like I've got a little bit of that smudged on there with my gloves. I can just wipe that away. But you have to do this before it hardens. And you can also kind of clean things up if you need to. So if you got a little blob or a little leak in the epoxy where you didn't want it, you can kind of smooth that in. For the most part, that looks pretty good. So now I'm going to leave this in a horizontal position and let it fully cure, or at least cure for its, it doesn't need to be fully cured, but cure for at least its 15 minutes. And then we'll come back and we will put on the launch lug in much the same fashion. My epoxy is cured enough to handle it, and if you look closely in here, you might see some little rough areas right along the edges there. And those can be sanded out if you like, but I would wait a good 24 hours to make sure that's completely hard before doing so. Alright, next we're going to put on the launch lug, and if I had been thinking ahead, I would have done this before we did the fins here. I would have at least marked it. Alright, so again, we don't have any specific instructions for where the launch lug needs to be. So I'm going to just go with 1/3 of the way from the aft end of the body tube. So I'm going to need a little bit longer ruler here. So this thing is about 41 centimeters long. Okay, and that's going to place our launch lug at just under 14 centimeters. I'm just going to go with that. Alright, so on the same side as my engine clip, I'm just going to mark here at 14 centimeters. Alright, and then I'm going to put the rocket here on my tube marking guide, like so. Okay, and I'm going to try to get about the same level as the engine clip there. And now I'm just going to draw a line here. I'm going to draw it all the way up just to make a good sight line. Okay, and now I can transfer my mark over to the line there. And then erase the old one. It's very easy to erase things from fiberglass. Okay, and now at that region here, just going to erase some of that. I'm going to take a little bit of sandpaper here, and I'm just going to roughen that area up a little bit. Now I'm going to take my launch lug here, and just like we did with the fins, I'm going to use super glue. I'll actually go ahead and roughen this a little bit too. Alright, so I use some thick super glue to do the initial bonding here. And then after it dries, we'll go ahead and put epoxy fillets on it again. Okay, so once you've got that on, use the line to sight your way down it. Okay, so this should be in parallel with the line and the body tube, and centered on the line. Okay, and once you get it at that point, then go ahead and let this harden. With the super glue, it only takes about 5 minutes or so, and then we'll come back and put fillets on. While I'm waiting for the launch lug glue to dry, we can go ahead and put the nose cone together here. And again, I'm going to go ahead and roughen this up a little bit on the inside, and then a little bit here on the base piece on its shoulder. You don't need much. Again, this just allows the glue to grip a little bit more. Now the best thing for this particular part is tube type plastic model cement. Although if you don't have any, gel type super glue works pretty well as a substitute. Alright, so we're just going to put a nice even bead here right inside the edge. Okay. You do want it to go all the way around there and be contiguous, but don't get so much that it melts the nose cone plastic. All right, then put the base in there and just kind of rotate it back and forth a few times. Okay, and then we'll set that aside to dry as well. One more thing we can do while the launch lug is drying is assemble a parachute. Now there's not a whole lot to do here. Since the parachute's all pre-assembled, it's a nice little nylon parachute. The shroud lines are kind of thick, and so that can give us a little bit of a problem here. Now with most model rockets, they simply tie this onto the nose cone. If you've seen my other videos, you know I don't like to do that. So what I'm going to do here is just gather up all the shroud lines on one finger and then pull those so that all of the corners match up on the parachute while I'm holding it in the middle. And then I'm going to take a snap swivel here. I'm going to use a fairly large one, not because of the weight of the rocket, but because of the thickness of these shroud lines. It's going to take a fairly big loop there. Alright, I'm going to put those all together and put them through the swivel side of the snap swivel. Alright, and holding on to them down here with this hand, I'm going to open up that loop again. Okay, and now I'm going to pass the entire snap swivel up through the loops. Pull the loops down, okay, and then pull those taut onto the snap swivel. Alright, check again, make sure that everything's still lined up, and if it is the way you want it to be, I'm going to pull these down so they don't wrap around the top there. Okay, and here I'm going to put a little dab of white glue or wood glue, or in my case white wood glue, onto that knot so that it doesn't unravel. Since this is fairly large, I'm going to do both sides there and just work that down into the knot. Okay, and then we'll let that dry, and then when we're ready to fly this, we can clip this onto the nose cone or into a loop on the shock cord. The super glue on the launch lug is dry, and here I'm mixing up just a very small amount of 5-minute epoxy. I'm just going to freehand this, but if you want to, you can use tape like we used on the fins. Alright, and now I'm just going to apply a little bit of alcohol to my fingers again here, and then just smooth these in. Okay, and then as before, I'm going to take a tissue with some alcohol on it to clean up around there. Oop. Accidentally caught a blob of epoxy there, so we just need to smooth that around. Okay, and now we just need to let that harden for about 5 minutes, and then we will come back and get ready to put everything together. My launch lug is finished, and the fillets look pretty good there. So the next thing we can do will depend on how you want to paint this. So if you want to put this all together first and then paint it all at once, that works fine. In that case, you simply need to tie on the shock cord here to the nose cone and then attach the parachute later on, since we used the snap swivel. I prefer to paint mine in pieces, and if you want to go by the actual suggested color scheme here, Okay, so they've got an all-white rocket with one red fin, and then you've got the decals there. The nose cone is already white, and this is a seamless nose cone, so it's actually got a really nice finish all by itself. If you want to go with a different color than what is on here, that also is fine. Although you want to keep in mind that if you're going to use the decals, you're going to want something that will contrast with them. So I'm going to paint my rocket before I do the final assembly, and so that will consist of a coat or two of primer, and then a base coat. Not quite sure what color I'm going to use yet, probably not white though. So I'm going to do all that off camera and then come back when everything's finished. The paint is done, and now we're ready to put on the decals here. And this is meant to hold the decal in place. So it's got a front paper on here. It's almost the consistency of masking tape. And when we cut these out, what we want to do is peel off the back while keeping them attached to the front here. And you can kind of take a fingernail and go ahead and rub that front piece on to make sure that it's holding. Alright, and then we can go ahead and cut these out using scissors or a hobby knife. And it looks like it's not quite printed straight on the paper. That's fine. I'm just going to use the letters themselves as a cutting guide here. Now if we come back to the packaging here, alright, if we want to do it in the same pattern that we have on here, the two roll patterns are going to go right at the end, forward end of the body tube, and then right above the fins. And so I'm going to start with those. Okay, so now we're going to peel off the back. Okay, and the trick here now is to peel it back at a backward angle there. So you may have to, so I'm basically folding the paper back on itself here. Here I have a small basin of room temperature water, and I've added just 1 drop of dishwashing liquid to that. And now I can dip the decals in that, and what this will do is temporarily make them less sticky, and that way it makes it easier to reposition them if we need to. And once you have them positioned, then just take a tissue or paper towel or even a cotton rag and squeegee out the water. And after about 24 hours, these will be attached permanently. Okay, then we're going to do the same thing down on the bottom. And as before, I'm going to carefully peel off the back. then the illustration here shows having the Mach1 and then the main decal all on the same side. Okay, so it's going to be a side that's not with the launch lug. Kind of pick one here. Although I may actually put the Mach1 down here and then the main one here, just to distribute it a little bit. Our final task is to attach the recovery system in the nose cone. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I decided just to leave the nose cone the way it is because it's already got a nice white finish. Okay, take our shock cord here and place that through the parachute protector, and this acts as wadding, and it's reusable. They're really nice. Okay, and now about, say, 20 centimeters down or so, I'm going to put in a loop using a water knot. Okay, it's just a single overhand knot loop. And this is where I'll attach the parachute instead of to the nose cone. And all this does is it lets the nose cone hang down during recovery instead of sticking out and causing the thing to spin. Alright, then we'll tie on to the nose cone. Alright, now this has got a lot of stiffness here to it from when we applied the super glue. I'm going to cut most of that off. Alright, and then a double knot or 2 half hitches here onto the nose cone. Alright, pull it from many directions. Okay, and if there's more than about 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters hanging there, go ahead and cut that back, but not all the way to the knot itself. Alright, this is why Kevlar makes such good body armor. It's really hard to cut, unless you put super glue on. Alright, speaking of which, now I'm going to put some super glue on that frayed area here so it doesn't go nuts, and also just a little dot on the knot to lock that in place. If you want to speed things up a little bit, you can just put a little bit of alcohol on that, which will speed the curing process. Okay, and then finally, attach the parachute to the loop here. Okay, and then when we're ready to launch this thing, we'll just put most of the shock cord down inside. Right, the Kevlar really doesn't need protection against the ejection gases. Right, and then we've got a little bit remaining here. Okay, for our parachute, I just like to make a wedge out of it like this. Bring the shroud lines up in a big loop. Right, and just kind of enclose them with the parachute. Bring that down and around. And then we're going to wrap our protector up around that, so it's basically forming a piston there. We'll shove that down inside. Right, now if you're encountering a lot of resistance, try repositioning things. Okay, and then finally we'll put the end of our shock cord in there and slide the nose cone in place. Now it feels very loose, so I recommend adding a little bit of masking tape to it, just around the shoulder here. And this may change on your launch day depending on the weather. So if it's hotter or more humid than when you packed it here, you may need to change it. Okay, now that's a little bit too thick, so we'll just peel a little bit of it back. That's about the right amount of snugness. Alright, so shake it now, it won't come off, but it still comes off relatively easy with a firm pull. So with that, this rocket is finished. Came out rather well. And as I said, this can be a gateway to larger fiberglass rockets. Hope you had a good time building this with me. Have a great launch and a safe recovery, and please stay tuned for more of my videos.